Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the second day of the Prevention Practitioners Network Symposium on integrating behavioral assessment and management. We were delighted by the level of participation in all three of our events yesterday, and we look forward to continuing those conversations today. For those of you who don't know, the Prevention Practitioners Network is an interdisciplinary network of professionals who are addressing targeted violence, terrorism, and their impacts across the United States. This morning, we are actually co-hosting our first panel, our plenary panel, with the Canadian Practitioners Network. And in a moment, I'll turn to Haida to introduce that network to those of you who may not be familiar with it. As I did yesterday, I will remind you, if you haven't had a chance to fill out our survey yet, and you've participated in past workshops, Neil will populate the link to that survey in the chat. If you filled it out over the last 2 weeks, you don't need to fill it out again. However, we do have one survey for all of you today, and Neil will launch that via Zoom. This program is being evaluated by the Research Triangle Institute, and we ask for your help in answering just a couple pre-questions. And then at the end of this session, we'll ask those same questions again. And that allows us to measure whether there's knowledge gained over the course of this session. So we appreciate your help through all of that. So Neil, go ahead and make those live now.
All right.
As our speakers present today, if you have any questions, please go ahead and populate those questions in the chat. Once we get to facilitated discussions, often the facilitators will ask you to read those questions aloud, and you may just be able to jump in, but certainly for this plenary session, we ask you to populate those questions in the chat. Full bios for the speakers can be found on the symposium website, and Neil will populate the link for that symposium website in the chat as well. Our first session this morning, as I mentioned, is co-hosted with the Canadian Practitioners Network. And the Canadian Practitioners Network was truly the inspiration for this Prevention Practitioners Network. So we're delighted to have the opportunity to collaborate with them. Our speakers this morning are Dr. Haida Hassan, Director and Founder of the Canadian Practitioners Network, Sarah Usman, she's the Mapping Coordinator for the Canadian Practitioners Network, and Patricia Kickland, who's the Program Manager for the Hawaii State Fusion Center. And as soon as we finish this survey, I will turn it over to Haida to introduce the Canadian Practitioners Network and the nationwide mapping exercise that they were able to complete over the past year.
Great, thank you so much, Brett, and thank you for, it's a great compliment saying that the CPN was the inspiration for the American network. It's a work in progress, as you know, so maybe, I don't know, Sarah or Neil, we have a PowerPoint deck we can share just to let you know a little bit more about CPN. So CPN actually started in 2016, 2017, more formally. And the purpose of CPN was really, came really out of, I am a practitioner, so I'm a person who works on ground, have the chance to be a researcher as well. But I really felt that the field of violent radicalization came to us like a big wave, and practitioners on ground, we really had very little support. We worked in silos. We didn't know how to tackle this. We were asked to tackle this rapidly. We worked so hard with little capacity, if I may say. And so CPN really started as a network for practitioners by practitioners. This is slide 4. I'm not sure I am myself able to move slides. I will try, but it seems like I do not have the control over the slides, so I let whomever is managing it. With one specific mission in mind, And this mission is really to push forward a whole societal response to violent radicalization and extremism, and understanding that, in a way, kind of shifting the field of prevention and intervention in violent extremism from a highly securitized field to a whole societal response that embraces pluralistic practices and the fact that actually every single sector of society has something to do at their own level within their own capacities, and really promoting, shaping proactively pathways for inclusion, while upholding very high ethical standards such as, rights for privacy, rights for freedom of speech, rights for protection and support of vulnerable individuals. And really, this is how CPN came to mind. So what we do at CPN, we actually have 6 axes, if we may say. The mapping, which we'll talk about today, and it was really pretty much inspired by what the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee does. Whenever there's a crisis in a country, you go out and map the capacity. So you try to understand who's where doing what in the field, in order to understand what are the needs, and then shape in a way the response so that it responds to the needs of the practitioners on ground. The idea was also to develop all sorts of knowledge mobilization tools and resources, and Maxime is here, he's the coordinator of knowledge mobilization, in order to build awareness, reduce stigmatization, reduce stereotyping, reduce ideological biases as well that may instill in that field. I think there's like a playing around with the PowerPoint. There are some issues. Hey, now it's working the right way. The idea also was to develop training, because honestly, when we started the field in Canada, we had very little knowledge and capacities and understanding what kind of information, what kind of tool do we need to develop as practitioners in order to intervene. And so we develop and constantly upgrade training modules. And finally, one of the deep objectives for CPN is to link the policy, the research, and the on-ground fields in order to ensure coherence, because if there is no coherence, then the result is chaos, basically. And the idea behind that is really to conduct systematic reviews, assemble all the existing scientific or research knowledge on, let's say, prevention, intervention, impact of online exposure to violent radicalization trajectories, and then, synthesize that and translate it in words that are, and in actually recommendations that are speakable and usable by practitioners. So this is pretty much what CPN is about. We're on our 5th year, and we hope to be able to continue for a few years to come. What we want to present to you today was the mapping that we did in trying to know who's doing what in Canada and what are the challenges that actually our practitioners are facing. So I'll hand it over to Sarah.
Thank you, Raida. So I will quickly go over the mapping research to give you some context about what we did during the mapping research. The purpose of this mapping was to identify the main frontline players in the field of prevention of radicalization, and to document their practices in order to obtain an overview of their activities and their reality on the ground. And for the purpose of the research, we interviewed 32 practitioners working for organizations that are doing secondary and tertiary prevention in a context of violent radicalization and extremism. For reference, in this presentation, the term intervention refers to secondary and tertiary prevention services, which means services offered to individuals who are at risk or in the process of violent radicalization, and also those who already committed offenses. The goal of the research was to determine who does what, where, how, and with whom which is a modified version of the 4W mapping methodology often used in a humanitarian context to determine where the resources are located. Okay, so let's start with who. We found that there are 3 main kinds of PCVE programs in Canada: the hubs and situation tables that are using a multi-agency model. We also have psychosocial teams that are usually more clinical and closer to the healthcare system. And we also have specific programs that are aiming to assist families or to help individuals who want to exit extremist groups. There are also 3 main sectors: the law enforcement sector, the psychosocial sector, regrouping mostly psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, also psychoeducators, and finally the community sector. So we found that in Canada, most initiatives are not specific to one kind of social polarization. So we adopt a more general approach to PCVE, and we also identify the needs locally instead of implementing, let's say, a program aiming to specifically tackle Islamic radicalization, because it led to stigmatization of some communities. And we're also putting forward a public health approach and interventions that are targeting risk and protection factors. So that's the approach that is privileged in Canada. Otherwise, Canadian organizations do offer a wide variety of services, ranging from mentorship and psychosocial services to educational support, employment support, etc. Usually more services are available in organizations with a hub or situation table model, since it is based on collaborations. And finally, where the programs are located, we found that most resources are located in 3 provinces in Canada, which are Quebec, Ontario, and Alberta. However, we found active extremist groups everywhere in the country. So that can pose a problem, because to fill the gap in services, many organizations need to cover additional territories than they were supposed to, which they are not necessarily prepared for financially or even in terms of staff. So it can cause an overload of work for them. So now that you have a bit of context regarding the mapping research and the Canadian prevention context, we will talk about the challenges in multisectoral collaborations that have been identified through the mapping interviews. So we found that one of the most important challenge to multisectoral collaboration is conflictual dynamics between some sectors, especially between the security sector and the psychosocial sector. And that is due to sometimes opposite frames of intervention and conflicting missions and mandates as well. So some organizations of the psychosocial sector had bad experiences working with law enforcement in the past because either they felt pressured to share information about beneficiaries when they could not, or to hand over a beneficiary to law enforcement, even though they think that the level of risk hasn't reached a high enough level to involve law enforcement. So that did cause some frictions between law enforcement and psychosocial teams. We also found that the perception of risk is different, especially between sectors, and there is also a difference in the duty to report criminal activities between psychosocial actors and law enforcement officers that can be problematic in some cases. We found as well that in many cases the conflictual dynamics are mitigated by interpersonal relationships. So I mean that a practitioner working in an organization that distrusts the police might say, oh, but I did work with that police officer in that unit, and I've seen the work he or she's doing, and I do trust him or her. And that happened to be a game changer and to open a lot of doors to collaboration, because they didn't know each other, and they've established a trust relationship between individuals, not necessarily inter-organizational, but it is still something that facilitated collaborations. So another challenge in multisectoral collaboration in a PCV setting is confidentiality and information sharing between practitioners that have different backgrounds. So how could practitioners that are subjected to different deontological orders of conduct share information? Because some professionals might be able to share information that others cannot, and vice versa. And this situation can lead to some frustrations between the involved parties. Then there is also those who are not subjected to deontological codes at all. And it poses an issue because these practitioners would not necessarily be disciplined if they do not abide by a determined set of rules and professional standards and principles. So this causes some distrust because before sharing sensitive information, practitioners need to ensure that the confidentiality will be preserved. And unfortunately, in some cases, there has been a situation where information was leaked to the media by one of the parties involved in the intervention, and it did have devastating consequences, not only for the beneficiary of the program, but also for their friends and family that received threats by neighbors at school, etc. So it's an important factor to consider as well. Which is also why it is important to develop clear guidelines and good practices in terms of information sharing in the context of multisectoral collaboration during PCV intervention. And as a matter of fact, we found that multidisciplinary teams that have such guidelines also have better relationships with their collaborators. And that includes the relationship between the law enforcement and mental health actors. So it does act as a facilitator as well. Another challenge is the fact that there is currently no mandatory background or credentials that are required in order to take part in PCV interventions with either at-risk individuals or individuals who are engaged in a trajectory towards violent radicalization. And practitioners often ask themselves who is habilitated to offer services to beneficiaries in such a context. And of course, their opinion vary from one team to another, and even in one team. In certain cases, it causes some frictions between organizations as well, because of the way they perceive others' organizations or teams' ability to take on beneficiaries and manage the risk properly. And one of the elements on which a practitioner's opinion varies is whether researchers with no clinical background can and should be involved in PCV interventions. And if so, what should be their role exactly, and their responsibilities as well. So on one hand, some think their lack of clinical experience is a liability, while others feel like their knowledge and understanding of the process of violent radicalization is an advantage that some clinicians do not necessarily have. Also, an unexpected result, I would say, was the role played by regular citizens with no professional or clinical background, sorry, in PCV interventions. So there has been some mobilization from members of the public who wanted to help people that they thought were engaged in a trajectory towards violent radicalization or extremism. So they did create some associations within their community, and they did gain valuable experience working directly in the field. And the question arises as whether or not we should discard that experience for the reason that they are not affiliated to any health or social services or to any kind of government agency. So that's another question that some practitioners are asking themselves regarding collaborations. And it also makes people wonder if PCV interventions should absolutely be conducted or supervised by clinical professionals. And what is the role of law enforcement in these interventions? Should they be a part of the interventions before the level of risk becomes potentially threatening for the individual and the security of the public? Or should they only intervene to enforce the law? In Canada, we also have some situational tables that mainly involve community organizations and psychosocial organizations, but that are facilitated by the police. So the police acts as a facilitator and when needed as enforcers. And lastly, there has been some discussions and controversy related to the implication of former extremists in intervention work. Many practitioners view them as very valuable members of their teams. Others think that their involvement should absolutely be guided by clinicians or that they should not be involved. So that's another challenge. Raida, would you like to add anything?
No, fine. I can. Do you want me to take it from here then, Sarah?
Yeah,
Okay.
sure, of course.
So we'll try to wrap it up. This is pretty much a summary of what Sarah has said, and I have put in the link in the chat. I mean, the link to the full report because it's so hard to summarize. You know, like a 50-page report. But I think that currently what we have is, on one hand, communities that have been stigmatized. And although now there is a big focus on, right-wing, violent right-wing extremism, white supremacy, Muslim communities still, in a way, suffer from the consequences of the previous years. There is also, unfortunately, as you heard, some questions that are still pending and quite challenging. Competition, unfortunately, between individuals and organizations, which hamper multisectoral collaborations because there's limited funding, because there are different frames of understanding. I think Sarah has, provided quite a detail around that. And unfortunately, there still are mutual misunderstandings on the, frameworks, guidelines of each organization, as well as each organization's competencies and capacities. So rumors tend to go quickly around, the ability of certain individuals or organizations to work in the field. And on the other hand, we have frames that maybe at times be and actually are or are perceived as opposite or contradictory missions, mandates, agendas, such as between law enforcement agencies and psychosocial actors. I wouldn't say that the frames are always contradictory, but sometimes they tend to be so, we have to admit it, and other times they tend to be perceived as so. We also have different frames and different pace of work between researchers, frontline workers, and the media as well. You can think about evaluation of programs, how much time it takes, whereas how much practitioners have to move fast on the ground in handling cases. This afternoon, this morning, I knew that this afternoon I have to stop things and just go and evaluate a case. So we work in very urgent context, which is not the timeline of governments and researchers. And then we have, frameworks of grassroots organizations that are very afraid that this domain will actually be used to further oppress resistance movements within the society. And we have huge challenges with media and the way media covers the phenomenon and the work. And all this kind of trickles down to a significant issue that is still unresolved. And I hope that this will open the discussion around the issue of sharing of information, confidentiality, and then trust, which then, when you think about inter-organizational coordination, trickles down into inter-organizational mistrust. And as Sarah said, sometimes it boils down to individual relationships. Now, intuitively, you and I know that this is pretty much about how everything works. But then the problem is that there is no organizational memory and there's no organizational culture of collaboration. So when individuals change, everything has to be started from zero, which is really a challenge. And just to end, because we don't want to go on forever, we have tabled some of the recommendations, but really these are food for thoughts. These are not guidelines. Hopefully they may be put in dialogue, let's say, with evidence and other organizations that have longer term practice to see if those recommendations are legitimate to be transformed into guidelines. I think the first recommendation, and this is something that we will hopefully be starting next year, is to develop tabletop exercises between law enforcement sector, psychosocial community sectors. So put those organizations together and do exercises on specific, of course, transformed in order to preserve confidentiality and anonymity cases, so that to develop this culture of working together in a trust environment where each organization can actually talk about their challenges to one another. Also, the fact that organizations should develop in advance a transparent framework to handle the issue of confidentiality, rights to privacy, freedom, and information sharing based on the standards of practice of this organization. And Sarah has shown us that organizations that have developed this upfront actually have better collaborations with their partners. We have also noticed that actually lack of trust between organizations was very much due to a misunderstanding of each other's mandates and approaches. So getting to meet, connect, and really explain to each other how each one works will undo those kind of reputation rumors, if you want, that are very easy to undo the collaborations. We have built last year a virtual community of practice where all practitioners get together and discuss clinical cases. And this has really raised ethical, legal, and human rights issue. But at the same time, it has really created a safe space for practitioners to discuss where things are difficult, to share our evaluation models, intervention models, and practices. And always, 15, 20 heads think definitely better than one. And finally, in the case of significant differences in the approaches that are put forward by different organizations, we are thinking that maybe putting up a written agreement that clarifies the roles and mandates on each side will actually set more positive conditions for collaboration and kind of facilitate exchanges with third-party organizations. So that's pretty much it on our side. I hope this has provided a framework to really bring the conversation forward. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Haida and Sarah. Patty, over to you for the United States perspective on where there's commonalities and where there may be differences. And Patty, if you're speaking, we can't hear you.
Thank you so much. Of course, the Zoom bar is right across the top of my PowerPoint, making it difficult for me to start slideshow. Oops. Please, somebody say out loud that you can see my slides and you can hear me.
You're all set?
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present today. I am Patty Kickland. I am a program manager with the State of Hawaii's Hawaii State Fusion Center. And first of all, I would like to say mahalo to the Canadian Practitioners Network, first of all, for the research that you've done, and then second, for sharing it with us all today. I think many of us have lived experience with these programs that closely matches what your research found. Our Office of Homeland Security, our mission is to prevent, protect, mitigate, respond, and recover to natural and human-made disasters. Human-made disasters include targeted violence, and prevention is an important part of our mission. I would like to take a minute and note that, part of the introduction was that I would provide an American perspective. And of course, there's a lot of diversity in the United States as well as elsewhere. I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge that in Hawaii, the history of Hawaii has included imperialism, and that there are differences and disagreements about Hawaii's status legally within the United States and what the relationship would be. I don't have any comment or promoting of any particular view, but I wanted to acknowledge that for people who might not know. So who here has heard this paradigm? When you're starting a program, there's a lead agency and they want to work together. So they reach out to everybody and then they build a team that they think of as kind of a circle. You can give me like a reaction or a head nod if you've been part of this. And I think it's a common way of program building, nothing wrong with it, but sometimes I think that multisectoral collaboration is a little different from this paradigm. Multisectoral, one of the things I really liked about Canadian Prevention Network's research was the recognition that when we work in the area of preventing targeted violence, and especially in the area of violent extremism, it's important to think about working outside the issue. This issue is so complex that sometimes we need outside help from people who we might not necessarily think would normally play a role in preventing targeted violence by violent extremists. And that includes practitioners, because as many of you are aware, the public health model for prevention indicates that helping people deal with their stressors, dealing with their risk factors is preventative. So, one of the things that I think Hawaii State Fusion Center has been working on to engage in a more multi-sectoral approach is this idea of a network, not just a circle of a team, but this is something called a mesh network. And you'll notice not only are there individual teams, but the nodes, the little round circles, are each connected to each other by a line. But unlike just a single circle or a single team or a single government agency or private agency working together, the nodes represent how all of these agencies have the opportunity to talk to each other. By building this mesh network and a multi-sectoral collaboration approach, we allow individual agencies, stakeholders to talk to each other, to avoid our agency or any other agency being a funnel or a gatekeeper. We found that this is important to gaining trust in the community. So when we think multi-sectoral, we think everybody working together, everybody talking to each other. And when it comes to information sharing, it goes both ways, including from the Hawaii State Fusion Center to our partners, including social service providers, healthcare professionals, and others who might not typically be thought of as customers of fusion centers. We know the benefits of multi-sectoral collaboration, right? You get more knowledge, more experience, more skills, more resources, and importantly, more perspectives, because people have different ways of thinking. And when you hear somebody else's different way of thinking, it helps us solve problems more creatively. So here's an example of a way the Fusion Center recently engaged in prevention work. Hawaii State Fusion Center has been working to develop behavioral intervention threat assessment teams, but not just teams within agencies, also not just community-wide behavioral intervention threat assessment teams, but actual certain subject matter or geographically specific behavioral intervention threat assessment teams that get together to talk about their particular issues in their subject matter, their area of critical infrastructure, and to receive specialized training in their field. And so Hawaii State Fusion Center has been trying to develop these teams or organizations, groups, hui, so that not only can they engage in behavioral intervention threat assessment and receive specific training and information helpful to them, but also so that they can serve as a bank of resources, so that if one group of specialists and practitioners needs help from another group, there's a place for them to go. Fusion Center is very happy to be a part of connecting people in this way. And of course, prevention being prevention practitioners coming from all kinds of area of subject matter. We have housing, substance abuse, domestic violence advocacy, everybody, of course, that we want to include when we do these programs. Those are the people that we all think about training and including in our program. And so what happened recently was somebody who's a member of the community came to the Hawaii State Fusion Center, as people will do, with a problem, a safety issue that they had noticed in their community. And because of the network that we had helped build and facilitate in the community and are humbled to be a part of, we were able to go to one of our banks of experts. It's called Threat TeamEDU. I can talk your ear off about that program. Long story short, a statewide program that includes people not just from one agency or one school district, but public, private, charter, K-12, post-secondary across all of the islands. We brought this individual's concern to our education threat assessment team. We used no PII, no private information, personally identifiable information. We just gave the facts of the case. Our team of multidisciplinary professionals was able to come up with various ideas for management, and likewise our Fusion Center contacts in domestic violence advocacy, child welfare services, education, and anti-trafficking organizations were likewise able to help us come up with management strategies that would help this person in the community who came to us with their concerns about two teenage girls who needed help. Now, this is an example of targeted violence prevention in general. How does it relate to preventing violence by violent extremists? You notice things like domestic violence advocacy, anti-trafficking. Remember what we talked about a little bit earlier about thinking outside just your circle and getting the outside help. Because sometimes violent extremism involves misogyny, misogyny as the heart of the violent extremist grievance, or tangential to it in forms of saying that women should occupy a certain role within whatever the movement is. when you think of thinking outside the circle, thinking outside the box, this is an example of how an anti-trafficking agency, a domestic violence advocacy agency, child welfare services can actually help in the prevention space when violent extremism includes those types of grievances. And in this case, we were able to help the individual who called the Fusion Center. So we learned, let people do their job. I really liked what Canadian folks had to say about sometimes people don't understand the values and the activities of other agencies. Listen to the advice that people give you. Be humble, recognize that other people know things that you don't, but continue to keep in touch. I'm so happy that we have this network, and now we have our Canadian fellows as well that we can all share our efforts with and hopefully combine all of our resources. So aloha to you. My name is Patricia Kicklin. Feel free to contact me or ask me any questions. Again, I'm very humbled to present to you today. Mahalo.
Thank you for that, Patricia. So now I want to invite our audience. Please, if you have questions, populate them in the chat. We'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible. But I wanted to start by turning to Haida and Sarah. What, if anything, surprised you about what you just heard from Patty? And what, if anything, can we do to strengthen learning across our two complementary networks?
Thank you, Brett. So thank you also, Patricia, for the very enlightening presentation. I think what I really loved in Patricia's presentation is the visual representation of what multisectoral collaboration really is. And it really shows how much people usually think multisectoral collaboration more as, actually what we would call interdisciplinary collaboration, meaning, I partner with that or X and Y professional that are not from the same, field or organization, whereas multisectoral collaboration is really a web structure. It is a structure that is kind of three-dimensional, where you actually, by connecting, you create this safety net, around individuals. So this is, this is something so important. And I feel that we need to educate actually, practitioners about what exactly is multisectoral collaboration. And what is interesting is that it really made me think about the hub models. So I don't know if my US colleagues know the hub model in Canada. There are more than 200 hubs in Canada, and this is not related to extremism. This is something that was established way before, and it is really this kind of all sorts of organizations. One of them bring a case to the attention, and then everybody tries to share the information that may be related and identify the organizations that can work together to offer support. I think the challenges, however, in the hub models in Canada when it relates to extremism and also other fields is the fact that most of them are managed by police or security services. And this has been very successful in certain cities because, every city has its own experience between law enforcement and non-law enforcement sectors, and has been very challenging in others. So I was just thinking that actually US and Canada are almost twin countries, and we have a lot of similar issues, and we tend to influence each other both in the positive practices, but also in negative challenges. And, we just can think about right-wing extremism and how, the first founders of some right-wing extremist movements in the US were actually Canadian. And then the movement grows in the US and then kind of goes back to Canada. So we have a lot, I think, to share one another.
Sarah, is there anything you want to add?
Well, thank you so much, Patricia, for your presentation. It was really enlightening and very appreciated. I feel, actually, I'm glad to see that you're also going forward with a multisectoral approach, because it really seems to be the way to go in terms of prevention of radicalization, by taking the individual in a holistic way and answering their needs in terms of protective factors and risk factors. We really help them at the root cause of the problem, instead of just judiciarizing them, putting them into the justice system and enforcing the laws. So we can really get them before they get there at a pre-criminal stage and answer their needs, so they don't need to get there and they really get their life back in track. So thank you for that. And I was wondering, in terms of challenges, what have you seen during your work in terms of challenges in multisectoral collaborations? I am curious to know more about that.
Sometimes people confuse information and conversation, especially people who come from a data-centered background, whether that means research, law enforcement, or intelligence. And so sometimes people who we collaborate with in prevention efforts feel a little bit slighted or annoyed when they don't get hard facts, when they don't get access to documents, when they don't get access to somebody else's database. I think that we can move forward with better information sharing through memorandum of understanding, legislation changes, and education in what each other's institutions do. At the same time, I think that when we form our partnerships and we form our mesh network or multi-sectoral collaboration, it really helps if the first thing that we do is not ask people for their information that they don't want to share. It is definitely possible to gain insight and assistance by talking about cases in hypothetical or talking about them anonymously. I do agree that sharing information is important from a public safety perspective, as well as from a community perspective, because the community should know the generalized threat landscape that we all face. But I think that we have to keep in mind the multiple reasons behind our program and take, like you folks are good at saying, a holistic approach to our various methods.
So the first question we received in the chat comes from Daniel Russell. And Patty, this is directed at you. Sarah and Haida spoke about the tensions between law enforcement and the psychosocial sector and providers in Canada. To what extent do these tensions exist in the United States?
They exist quite a bit, especially with the recent emphasis on racist murders by police. And then, like our Canadian fellows also noticed, historically a perception of law enforcement and other government agencies targeting particular groups of individuals. They do exist. It needs improvement. You might have noticed during my presentation, I didn't talk a heck of a lot about law enforcement. We're a fusion center. We work very closely with law enforcement. However, one of the tensions that exist between these groups involves the perception that one group on both sides, one group feels it about the other and vice versa, are trying to invade someone's sphere, or we call it in Hawaii, it's your kuleana, your small area of responsibility, trying to invade each other's sphere like that. I think in the future it will help if we remember that sometimes when one agency wants to really concentrate or focus on an area, that does come from a place of concern. We don't always understand the concern of the other agency because we don't understand how they practice prevention, but that will help, I think, in the future. Thank you.
And Sarah and Haida, I'm going to flip that question back to you. You were kind enough to host several US-based practitioners shortly before the pandemic, or I guess a few years ago now. And one of the challenges I heard was building confidence among behavioral and mental health practitioners that they had the competence to handle these types of cases and take these types of referrals. How have you worked to build that confidence as well as competence over time?
Thank you, Brett. So I think that one of the issues that we were tackled with is the feeling of confidence capacity, the fear, the anxiety that working with, extremist violent individuals provoke in practitioners that were not used to working in this field, right? I mean, we have put a lot of emphasis in our training program on a self-reflective, critical, intercultural approach to understanding the phenomenon and helping practitioners understand that a lot of what they do in other fields actually apply in this context, because, these are individuals who have, in a way, in a transcultural perspective, we can think that violent radicalization is a new way of suffering, and then practitioners have developed a lot of tools to deal with suffering. And this is just, a new available way, and a lot of the needs that these individuals present are common to other individuals as well. And so, but also to admit that there are specificities around these issues. So we have developed 8 training modules that you can, compose in ways that fit your organization. And these modules are constantly, the community of practice, Brett, has been essential. It has been an incredible space for sharing both professionally and personally, and how those two aspects of our lives intersect in our practice. So this really has been a tremendous help, and we are currently evaluating it, and the results are pretty positive. It has been of great support. One of the things that I have also noticed, Brett, and I don't know if my US colleagues, you notice the same thing, is that one of the main problems we are facing in the practice is that psychosocial practitioners are also often caught in ideological conversations with the clients. And I am more and more thinking, and I really would love to hear from everybody here about what they think, that this is not a good idea. I have the impression that our practitioners are really struggling and being brought out of their role as people who help in housing, who provide psychotherapy, who help reintegrate the individuals in society or help them out of the way of extremism. This is what we are used to. We are not used to discussing about deep ideologies, and we have zero knowledge in those ideologies. So we are caught in doing quote unquote de-radicalization work, whereas our talents are in reintegration work. And I'm thinking that maybe one way to go ahead is actually to separate both. So to have in every team individuals, practitioners who are specialized in reintegration work, who are there to support the individual in responding their needs, and other individuals who are specialized in ideologies and who can have that conversation with our clients. Because what is happening now is that the conversation around ideology, excuse the term, is polluting the one-on-one support, psychosocial support that practitioners, and it's also creating an effect of fear and fatigue in our practitioners. So this is something that I would like, sorry, I've talked for a bit, but I think this is a crucial issue. And I want to highlight Patricia's remark that we should stop creating silos between intimate partner violence, bullying, delinquency, criminality, and violent radicalization. We are seeing more and more, and child abuse, we're seeing more and more that these areas actually intersect. And so we should talk to our practitioners from those other fields.
And Haida, I always say that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. We are looking to build a community of practice next year, build that into this network, because we've heard from so many of your practitioners how helpful that's been for them. We've got a rather long question in the chat from Rob Mundy. So Rob, do you feel comfortable turning on your camera and mic and asking that yourself?
Hi, yes. Sorry, I'll leave my camera out because we're moving in 2 days and my house is a mess. I apologize.
Fair enough.
So I'm a social worker. I've worked alongside law enforcement on anti-trafficking task forces for children in the adoption world and for folks engaged in extremism. And one thing I noticed was so many law enforcement officers were really hurt from their work, like many social workers. And as a result of that pain, sometimes experience this desire to maintain kind of rigid control over the process. And one thing that we found really helpful in our work, and sometimes failed to do, but we tried as hard as we could in other contexts, was to help people see that it was okay to be hurt and also link them to resources to help them be well. I'm wondering if that's come up for you guys at all in your multidisciplinary approach. And if so, what strategies have you found effective to help every partner know that it's normal and okay to get hurt by this work and that taking care of yourself is really important?
That's a great question, Rob, and we've learned it on the way. We actually have a couple of practitioners who are on leave right now because they were exhausted. This is what we do now. Well, in the training module, there is like the whole module around self-care and vicarious trauma and post-traumatic growth. But we now always work in dyads. No practitioner takes on a case on their own. And we have seen that working in dyads, even within like the most basic psychosocial support, has been helpful both for our clients, but also for our practitioners. And unfortunately, we have to set boundaries. You know, as one of my colleagues, David O'Brien, says it, we have a phone line that's open. And when people are in crisis, they're not in crisis between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m., right? So they're often in crisis where we actually are leading our non-professional lives. And yet we have to make ourselves available. So we are trying to change the system. One other challenge that we have been facing, Rob, and I don't know if you have been facing it, is that although we have specialized teams who take those clients, when we want to refer them to get additional support to the other organizations, everybody's refusing that. And this should change. Like in Canada, this cannot keep being the case. These individuals have to go back to the services that are available for them in their community. And we have to make community organizations, other health, psychosocial, psychoeducational supports present in the community, that these individuals, that you have to provide services. They don't need to go from the east of the city to the only specialized service that's actually 1 hour drive away when a service is available in their area. And we have to stay as the specialized team as a backup support. Have we achieved this in Canada? My answer is no. This is something that we will have to work hard on in the coming years, hopefully.
And Patty,
Thank
I
you,
know
Dr.
you.
Fong.
Oh, sorry, Rob. Go ahead.
Just said thank you, really appreciate that. That's useful insight. And we did see the same pressures from practitioners diving into things that probably shouldn't, not getting the care that they deserve to begin with to do the work.
And Patty, I wanted to give you a chance to respond as well. I know you've been typing some of your responses into the chat.
Here's a story that I hope may help answer the question. Back when I was a deputy prosecutor for the city and county of Honolulu, I spent a lot of my career prosecuting sexual assault cases, trafficking cases, and other types of abuse. And when we initiate a prosecution, often we take a case to grand jury. For those of you who might not know, that's when we present certain evidence in our case to a group of people who decide if there's enough evidence for us to proceed with a wholesale prosecution. And presenting that evidence often includes examining children, other vulnerable individuals on the record and asking them to talk about extremely sensitive and personal experiences and privacy, physical privacy. And back at the prosecutor's office, you could always tell when your colleague had finished a grand jury with a child witness, because your colleague would come into your office and just want to talk. It was like they'd come in and they'd sit on your chair and they're not talking about any particular case or anything work related. You're like, yep, you went to grand jury because you're in pain. One of the benefits of our prevention programs overall involves communication and discussing management efforts and risk factors, etc. And just having the discussion, letting people talk, even if it's not in a communication style that you might be used to, would be very helpful. Another thing is sometimes people in law enforcement, military intelligence don't understand things like trauma-informed care or other forms of trauma, sometimes generationally inflicted. And when if you can help them understand those paradigms, that will help your partners that might not understand them, understand kind of what's going on in their heads and hearts, and give them a perspective to seek help or recognize things that they can do to help themselves. But thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Our next question comes from Jody Travesero. Jody has actually been building a parallel network in the state of California. Jody, do you want to go ahead and ask your question directly?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for your wonderful presentations. In the chat, I tried to write a nice long question there. We use tabletop exercises and scenario discussions to, to reveal gaps and assumptions. We complete a THIRA every year and an SPR as a requirement for our Homeland Security grant. But as you beautifully described, there are many stay in your lane type comments that are made. And I understand that. I understand when it's critical to keep everybody staying in their lane so they could focus on what they need to do. So I was wondering if we, in our effort to try and involve, I'll say, more law enforcement, more behavioral health, more educators, more juvenile probation, do you have ideas or scenarios or thoughtful questions that help explore that need? So people can see the need to sort of expand that or create the mesh network, I guess, as our previous presenter, previously or described. I mean, both of these presentations have been great for me to understand how Canada and Hawaii are creating these multi-sector engagements. So any advice you have would be welcomed.
Would my Canadian partners like to talk, or else I have a response, but want to give you guys a chance? Okay, I'm getting the little wavies. I'd like to share with you something that was really fun and helpful. I work with the counselors, social service providers, education professionals who have no idea what TTP is and do not think about operations and do not think about tactics when it comes to terrorist attacks. Something that was really fun to do when we did a tabletop exercise about identifying and assessing a threat was using the scenario and then asking them the question, how is this person likely to commit an attack? When, where, who's the target? And the people I was dealing with, very used to talking about stressors, risk factors, they didn't think that they had any way to answer that question. But then I walked them through it. Okay, does this person have access to a car? The target, let's say domestic violence, works in a secure area. Where's the weakest point of the secure area? If the subject goes to the target's place of employment to commit a domestic violence murder. And slowly but surely, they learned that it is possible to assess and even predict or come to judgments or assessments about things like TTP. And then they understood where law enforcement, military, and intelligence was coming from when they wanted to keep some things close hold, like operations, when they don't always want to talk about how things go down because they don't want to give other people ideas how to do things, but also how people from the other side, or I won't say the other side, people from the interesting side they hadn't heard from, how they think and how they actually have expertise that is intended to keep the public safe. It's really interesting expertise, and it shows the level of dedication, education, experience, and training that their newfound partners and Mesh Network participants have. It created a big appreciation for my social worker, counselor, education type professionals for the type of work that was done. So thanks. I would encourage any of you to try that. I still have the scenario if you'd like to take a look at that, but that was fun. It was helpful. And I can imagine it going the other way around too, but I don't want to hog the conversation.
unfortunately, we're out of time, but I've certainly done tabletops where I have both sides play the other side. And so you can go many directions with tabletops. And Patty, if you're willing to share your contact information again, so people who are looking for that scenario can reach out to you, that would be fantastic. So I'm going to ask Neil to populate our post evaluation question, and he's going to explain how that process works. But before that, I just want to thank Haida, Sarah, and Patty. Thank you so much for your remarks this morning, and thank you for kicking off the second day of our symposium.
Yeah.
After you finish this this post survey, we will take a brief break, and we'll be back at 12:15 Eastern. Neil, over to you.